On a quiet morning in late autumn, long after the crowds had disappeared, the iron gates of Neverland Ranch stood closed beneath a pale California sky. A thin layer of dust rested on the sign, its colors faded by years of sun and silence. Inside the property, the carousel sat perfectly still. No music played, no laughter drifted through the air. The painted horses faced the same direction they had faced for years, frozen mid-dream. A narrow road curved past the empty train station, where no small train would arrive again. The grass was trimmed, but carefully, the way land is kept when it is no longer loved, only maintained. Somewhere deeper on the estate, a security guard walked his routine path, boots crunching lightly on gravel, passing places that once demanded applause and now asked for nothing at all. Windows reflected the morning light without revealing what lay behind them. Doors remained shut. The house itself did not look abandoned. It looked paused, as if waiting for someone who was not coming back. For a place built to celebrate imagination, the quiet felt heavy, not peaceful, heavy. And standing there, in that stillness, the question became impossible to avoid. How did a ranch created to protect a dream of never growing up end up sealed in silence, remembered more for what it lost than for what it once promised? To understand why this morning unfolded the way it did at Neverland Ranch, we have to return to the moment when the dream first took shape. This is the story of Neverland Ranch, a private estate in California built by one of the most famous entertainers the world has ever known. It is a story that begins with extraordinary success, moves through an attempt to freeze time itself, and ends with a place that could not escape the weight of reality. This is not simply a story about fame. It is a story about a man who rose from relentless pressure into unimaginable wealth, then tried to use that wealth to rebuild something he felt had been taken from him. From a childhood lived under discipline and cameras, to global dominance of popular culture, to a retreat behind locked gates and guarded roads. From applause that never seemed to end, to silence that would not go away. Neverland Ranch was not designed as a mansion in the traditional sense. It was designed as an answer to a childhood that felt incomplete, an answer to a world that demanded constant performance, an answer to the idea that growing up was inevitable. This video explores how a place created to preserve innocence became inseparable from controversy, how a sanctuary became a liability, and how a dream meant to protect one man ultimately outlived him in a very different form. By the end of this story, you will understand why wealth could build a fantasy but could not keep it safe, why a private refuge could never truly be private, and why the walls of Neverland Ranch would come to define a legacy as much as the music ever did. To see how that transformation happened, we need to go back to the beginning, long before the gates were closed, when the idea of Neverland still felt possible. Michael Jackson was born into a house where silence was rare and pressure was constant. Music filled the rooms, but so did discipline. From an early age, his days followed a schedule set by adults, rehearsals replacing play, performance replacing rest. Home was not a refuge, it was a training ground. Applause arrived early, but privacy never did. While other children learned where they belonged by returning to the same bedroom each night, Michael learned that belonging was conditional, earned only when the music was perfect and the routine was followed. The world saw a gifted child behind closed doors. He experienced a childhood shaped by expectations that did not pause for fear or fatigue. There was little space to fail and no permission to be ordinary. As fame expanded, the sense of safety shrank. Hotels replaced houses, tours replaced neighborhoods. Familiar places disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Even success did not come with stability. It came with movement, with watchful eyes, with the understanding that he was always being observed. Long before Neverland Ranch existed, the idea of a protected space had already begun to form, not as luxury, but as necessity. A place where time could slow down, a place where childhood might finally feel finished on his own terms. As Michael Jackson moved into adulthood, the world never adjusted its expectations. Fame followed him into every room, every city, every attempt at rest. There was no transition from child star to private adult life. Only a continuous spotlight that refused to dim. Success gave him resources, but it did not give him distance. The industry rewarded performance, not withdrawal. Contracts with tours and public appearances filled the calendar, leaving little room for silence. Even moments meant to be personal were observed, documented, interpreted. In that environment, the idea of home began to change meaning. Home was no longer a place he came from. It was a place he had to create, a place designed to keep the outside world at bay. At the same time, his relationship with childhood did not fade the way it does for most people. It lingered. Unresolved, play, fantasy, and innocence became symbols of something unfinished, something interrupted too early. This was not nostalgia, it was compensation. The more responsibility followed him, the more he searched for spaces where responsibility did not exist. Society expected maturity, restraint, and distance. What he felt instead was exhaustion. The pressure was not dramatic, it was constant, quiet, unrelenting. Over time, that pressure reshaped his priorities. Security became more important than openness, control more important than connection. Long before Neverland Ranch had a name, its purpose was already clear. It would not be a display of wealth, it would be a boundary, a constructed world where the rules could be rewritten, where time did not move forward unless he allowed it to. In that sense, Neverland was not an escape from adulthood. It was an attempt to finish a childhood that never had the chance to end. The decision to leave behind familiar places was not dramatic. It was gradual, shaped by repetition. Each return to a hotel room that looked like the last one, each city that blurred into the next, reinforced the same realization. There was nowhere that belonged to him. Success provided access, but it did not provide roots. The more his world expanded, the smaller his personal space became. Privacy turned into a negotiation. Safety became a calculation. At a certain point, movement itself began to feel like risk. That was when the idea of a permanent retreat stopped being abstract. It became practical. He did not want a mansion in the traditional sense, defined by status or lineage. He wanted land, distance, control over who entered and who stayed away. California offered sunlight and space. But more importantly, it offered isolation without disappearance. A place close enough to industry to remain functional, yet distant enough to feel separate. The choice was not about luxury. It was about autonomy. Leaving familiar homes was not an escape from people. It was an attempt to escape exposure, to replace borrowed spaces with a territory that answered only to him. This was the final step before Neverland Ranch could exist. Not the purchase itself, but the decision to stop adapting to places he did not choose, to stop living inside schedules designed by others. What he carried with him into that decision was simple: fatigue, distrust, and a hope that if the ground belonged to him, the life built on it might finally feel stable. From that moment forward, the idea of Neverland was no longer a fantasy. It was a plan. By the late 1980s, Michael Jackson's public success had already reached a scale few entertainers ever experience. Albums traveled faster than he did. His image moved ahead of his presence. Wherever he arrived, expectations were already waiting. This level of recognition changed how space functioned around him. Hotels became temporary stages. Studios became controlled environments. Public places became risks. At the same time, the financial machinery surrounding his career expanded. Tours grew larger. Contracts became longer. Every decision involved layers of management, security, and negotiation. Wealth was abundant, but freedom was not. It was during this period that the idea of a permanent base shifted from preference to necessity. He needed a place that could absorb the weight of his visibility, a place that could hold his work, his routines, and his private life without collapsing under attention. When he acquired the land in California that would become Neverland Ranch, it was not framed as a real estate investment. It was framed as infrastructure. The beginning was modest by later standards: existing ranch buildings, open land, distance from major roads. What mattered was not appearance, but potential. the space could be shaped, expanded, controlled. As his professional empire continued to grow, so did the logic behind the property. Every new responsibility increased the need for separation. Every new demand increased the value of autonomy. Neverland Ranch was conceived alongside the peak of his influence, not after it. It was built while his career was still accelerating, when the idea of withdrawal still felt optional. In that moment, the ranch functioned as an extension of success rather than a reaction to failure. It was meant to support momentum, not escape it. The intention was clear: build a place that could carry the scale of a global life, without surrendering the individual inside it. That foundation set the direction for everything that followed. As the land began to change, the project moved beyond practicality and into intention. What took shape was not a single house, but a contained world. Paths were laid out to control movement. Buildings were placed to separate functions. Work, rest, play, and privacy were given their own zones. The ranch expanded quietly, piece by piece. Without the announcement that usually follows estates of that scale, a private train circled the grounds. A small zoo appeared, then grew. Spaces for film, music, and daily routine were folded into the landscape. Each addition served a purpose: convenience, security, distance. Neverland Ranch did not follow architectural tradition because it was not meant to inherit anything. It was meant to invent. The design rejected lineage and embraced customization. Instead of formal halls and inherited symmetry, the layout favored control and flexibility. Gates could close, roads could divert, sightlines could be managed. The property became less about beauty and more about function disguised as fantasy. This was not extravagance for its own sake. It was insulation. The deeper the estate grew, the fewer reasons there were to leave it. The outside world remained present through business and obligation, but its physical intrusion was reduced. The ranch absorbed daily life so completely that movement beyond its borders became optional. That was the goal: to remove friction, to replace unpredictability with routine chosen on his own terms. In that sense, the construction of Neverland Ranch mirrored the structure of his career: highly planned, precisely managed, designed to deliver performance while limiting vulnerability. As the ranch took form, it sent a message that was easy to misunderstand. To outsiders, it looked like excess. To him, it looked like survival. A system built to keep attention at a distance while allowing creativity to continue without interruption. By the time the major elements were in place, Neverland Ranch no longer felt like a property under development. It felt like a finished answer to a question he had been asking since childhood. How do you live when the world refuses to leave you alone? As construction continued, the meaning of Neverland Ranch became clearer, even as its appearance grew more elaborate. This was not a home built to impress visitors. It was built to answer something internal. Each structure, each attraction, each controlled path reflected a decision about how life should feel inside the gates. The ranch offered certainty in a career defined by volatility. Inside its boundaries, days could be predictable, nights could be quiet. The outside world still existed, but it no longer dictated rhythm. In this sense, Neverland Ranch was not just parallel to his professional empire, it was its counterweight. Where the industry demanded constant visibility, the ranch offered concealment. Where fame required performance, the property allowed retreat. The symbolism was subtle but consistent. A private train meant movement without exposure. A zoo meant companionship without crowds. A theme park meant joy without obligation. These were not indulgences, they were substitutes. Replacements for experiences that had been denied or distorted earlier in life. The ranch became a physical argument against inevitability, against aging, against loss of control. It suggested that if the environment could be designed precisely enough, then vulnerability might be reduced. But this logic carried its own risk. The more complete the world inside Neverland Ranch became, the less practice there was in living outside it. Autonomy increased, but so did dependence on the system he had built. By the time the ranch reached its full form, it no longer simply supported his life. It structured it. Choices became easier within its boundaries and harder beyond them. The estate solved one problem by quietly creating another. It delivered stability at the cost of isolation. In building Neverland Ranch, he had succeeded in making a place that reflected his needs perfectly. What was not yet clear was whether such a place could adapt when those needs began to change. That question would remain unanswered for years, waiting beneath the surface of a property that looked complete but was already vulnerable. During the years when Neverland Ranch felt fully alive, evenings followed a rhythm that belonged only to the property. Cars arrived along the private road, slowing before the gates, then disappearing into the landscape. Inside, lights came on one by one, not to announce a spectacle, but to prepare for it. Music played softly at first, then faded into conversation. Guests moved between spaces that were designed to feel effortless, as if the land itself guided them. The theater filled without urgency. The train circled the grounds without destination. Laughter carried across open areas and dissolved before it reached the perimeter. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt watched. For those inside, time loosened its grip. The ranch did not behave like a venue. It behaved like a contained season, repeating itself night after night with small variations. Staff understood the cadence. They knew when to step forward and when to disappear. Children explored without itinerary. Adults lingered without schedules. In those moments, the ranch succeeded at its central promise. It created a pause. The world outside continued to move, but its pace no longer dictated the mood within the gates. This was not escapism in the dramatic sense. It was insulation. The quiet kind that settles after the noise has been absorbed by distance. Even the grandeur served a practical function. Scale reduced intrusion. Space softened attention. The ranch offered something rare to a life defined by demand: continuity. Nights ended gently. Mornings began without urgency. The environment rewarded repetition rather than novelty. Over time, these evenings blended together, forming a memory that felt stable precisely because it changed so little. For a while, Neverland Ranch functioned exactly as intended. It held people without exposing them. It hosted joy without requiring performance. It allowed presence without consequence. In those years, it was easy to believe that the balance could last, that the place had finally solved the problem it was built to address, that this version of life could repeat indefinitely, protected by land, distance, and design. As those years unfolded, the internal life of Neverland Ranch became more defined than its outward image. Each space developed a role that went beyond function. The theater became a place for shared attention, without public judgment. The dining areas became zones of routine rather than ceremony. Bedrooms were not symbols of status, but of retreat. Movement through the property followed familiar paths, reinforcing a sense of predictability. Children gravitated toward open areas where supervision felt distant but present. Adults gathered where conversation could stretch without interruption. Staff operated with minimal visibility, maintaining an atmosphere where presence felt natural rather than managed. In this ecosystem, the ranch acted less like an estate and more like a small, self-regulating town. It absorbed needs before they became problems. It reduced conflict by reducing exposure. The architecture encouraged separation without isolation, closeness without crowding. Over time, the house and grounds began to influence behavior as much as they reflected it. Noise softened, schedules relaxed, urgency lost its purpose. The ranch trained its inhabitants to slow down. For its owner, this environment offered something he had rarely known: control without confrontation, stability without scrutiny. The world beyond the gates still demanded explanation and performance. But inside, those demands lost their authority. The ranch did not ask who someone was in public. It only asked how they moved within its boundaries. This dynamic deepened loyalty and comfort. It also narrowed perspective. As life inside Neverland Ranch became more complete, life outside it felt increasingly abstract. Events beyond the property mattered less. Time beyond its routines felt distant. The estate succeeded in creating coherence, but coherence came with dependency. The more the ranch organized daily life, the less necessary outside structures became. In those years, this trade felt reasonable. even beneficial. The system worked because it was insulated from challenge, yet that insulation carried a quiet cost. It made change harder to absorb. It made disruption feel more threatening than it might have otherwise been. At the height of its golden age, Neverland Ranch did not simply host life, it shaped it, and in doing so, it set conditions that would later prove difficult to sustain. At its peak, Neverland Ranch no longer felt experimental, it felt settled. Days followed patterns that rarely needed explanation. Mornings unfolded quietly, afternoons stretched without pressure. Evenings returned to familiar rituals that required little coordination because everyone already knew where to be. The ranch had learned its own habits, and those habits reinforced a sense of permanence. For its owner, this stability carried emotional weight. It suggested that something fragile had finally been secured. The space no longer needed to prove itself. It simply existed, reliable and predictable. That reliability became its greatest comfort and its greatest illusion. Because nothing demanded immediate change, the possibility of change itself began to feel unnecessary. The ranch rewarded sameness. It protected routine. Over time, that protection blurred into avoidance. Difficult conversations could be postponed. External tensions could be kept outside the gates. Problems did not disappear, but they lost urgency. Inside Neverland Ranch, delay felt harmless. The environment absorbed uncertainty and softened its impact. This created a powerful sense of control. Life felt manageable because it was contained, yet containment came with a narrowing of perspective. The wider world continued to shift, but those shifts arrived, filtered, and delayed. Signals of risk weakened as they crossed distance and security. The estate was so effective at buffering pressure that it also muted warning signs. In this way, the Golden Age carried the seeds of its own instability. What worked in calm conditions would struggle under strain. The routines that created comfort would resist disruption. The system depended on consistency to function, and consistency is fragile when circumstances change. At the height of its success, Neverland Ranch appeared complete. It had fulfilled its promise of shelter, continuity, and refuge. But beneath that appearance, a quiet dependency had formed. The ranch did not just support a way of life, it required it. Any challenge to that structure would be felt not as adjustment, but as threat. For now, none of that seemed urgent. The gates stayed closed, the nights stayed calm, the routines repeated, and because they repeated so smoothly, it was easy to believe they always would. That belief defined the final moments of Neverland Ranch's golden age, a period when stability felt permanent and vulnerability remained hidden, waiting for conditions that would force it into view. The first changes at Neverland Ranch did not arrive as crises. They arrived as adjustments, small shifts in rhythm, longer pauses between gatherings, fewer evenings that required preparation. The ranch still functioned, but its energy began to thin. Outside the gates, pressures accumulated quietly. Financial obligations grew heavier as the scale of past success demanded constant maintenance. Legal matters required attention and time. Travel increased again, breaking the routines that had once held the property together. Inside the ranch, these pressures registered indirectly. Staff schedules became more cautious. Security protocols tightened. Spaces that once felt open began to feel monitored. None of this appeared dramatic on its own. Each change made sense in isolation. Together, they altered the atmosphere. The ranch started responding to the world rather than excluding it. That shift mattered. The system had been designed to minimize friction. Now it was absorbing it. At the same time, the cost of sustaining the environment rose. The land demanded upkeep. Attractions required staffing. Silence required labor. Maintaining stability became an active process rather than a natural state. What had once felt effortless now required coordination. This introduced strain. Decisions multiplied, delays carried consequences. Inside the property, routines adapted, but they also lost elasticity. When schedules changed, the system resisted. When plans shifted, tension surfaced. The architecture that once buffered stress now reflected it. Corridors felt longer, rooms felt emptier. The ranch did not announce decline. It signaled fatigue, the kind that appears before failure, when systems still function but no longer renew themselves. For its owner, this phase was confusing. The place had delivered exactly what it promised. It had created stability. Now stability itself felt fragile. The problem was not a single event. It was accumulation. Pressure from outside, meeting resistance inside. The ranch had been built to protect against intrusion, not to adapt to prolonged uncertainty. As these hairline cracks formed, they remained easy to dismiss. Nothing was broken. Everything still worked. And because everything still worked, it was tempting to believe that nothing had changed. As pressure continued to build, its effects began to surface in more personal ways. The balance inside Neverland Ranch depended on trust, familiarity, and routine. When those elements weakened, relationships felt the strain first. Fewer people stayed for long stretches. Visits shortened. Conversations became careful. The atmosphere shifted from ease to management. What had once been spontaneous now required planning. Comfort turned into caution. Outside obligations intruded more frequently, pulling attention away from the property and breaking continuity. Inside, absence created gaps that routine could not easily fill. Rooms waited longer between uses. Tables were set less often. The ranch still offered shelter, but it no longer felt shared in the same way. This change was subtle but persistent. It altered how people moved and spoke. Silence expanded into spaces that had once been lively. At the same time, expectations from beyond the gates intensified. The public image required defense. Decisions carried reputational weight. Advisors and schedules began to shape daily life more than personal preference. The ranch had been designed to separate public and private existence. Now, that separation blurred. Meetings followed him home. Concerns traveled through corridors that were meant to remain neutral. The architecture could buffer sound and sight, but it could not filter meaning. Tension seeped into places built for rest. The effect was cumulative. Each compromise seemed minor. Together, they redefined the environment. The ranch began to feel less like a refuge and more like a perimeter. Safety remained, but ease diminished. This created a quiet contradiction. The place built to simplify life now demanded attention to keep it functioning. Emotional energy shifted from living to maintaining. For its owner, this was disorienting. The original purpose of Neverland Ranch had been clarity, a space where choices felt simple. Now choices multiplied. Each decision about presence or absence carried consequences. Avoidance became tempting because confrontation felt costly. Over time, this dynamic reinforced distance rather than resolving it. The ranch responded by becoming quieter, more controlled, more inward. These were not signs of collapse. They were signs of compression, the kind that precedes release. The system tightened to protect itself, unaware that rigidity was reducing its resilience. In this phase, the cracks remained narrow and easy to overlook. Nothing forced change yet, but the margin for error had begun to shrink. The final stage of these early fractures appeared in how time was experienced inside Neverland Ranch. Days no longer flowed evenly. Some stretched too long. Others collapsed into obligation. The rhythm that once made the estate feel self-sustaining began to stutter. Waiting replaced anticipation. Maintenance replaced imagination. Spaces built for play and openness became quieter, not from neglect, but from restraint. Access narrowed. Movement slowed. The ranch remained operational, yet its emotional tempo shifted. What had once absorbed uncertainty now reflected it back. Small disruptions carried outsized weight. A delayed visit felt symbolic. An empty room felt intentional, meaning accumulated where it had not before. This heightened sensitivity created tension without spectacle. Nothing failed publicly, everything strained privately. The estate had been designed as a system of buffers. Distance from roads, gates from intrusion, scale from noise. But buffers require balance. When pressure persists, buffers compress. They lose elasticity. Inside the ranch, this compression altered decision-making. Choices became defensive. The goal shifted from growth to preservation, from expansion to containment. That shift marked a turning point. A place meant to protect innocence now worked to protect itself. The difference was subtle but decisive. Once preservation becomes the priority, change is perceived as threat. This narrowed the future. Options remained, but they felt risky. The ranch held steady by resisting motion. It looked calm. It sounded controlled. But calm created by resistance carries cost. Over time, the effort to keep everything as it was consumed more energy than living within it. The estate was no longer a canvas. It was a structure under tension. Still, none of this demanded immediate action. Systems often appear strongest just before they fail to adapt. From the outside, Neverland Ranch remained intact. From the inside, it had begun to harden. These were the final hairline cracks, not loud enough to alarm, not visible enough to provoke response, but precise enough to shape what would follow. When pressure eventually increased, there would be little flexibility left to absorb it. The ranch had reached the limit of what routine could carry. Everything still stood. Everything still functioned. But the margin between stability and collapse had become thin. The collapse did not begin with a single night or a single decision. It began with convergence. Pressures that had lived apart now arrived together and demanded response. Legal strain narrowed options. Financial obligations accelerated timelines. Public scrutiny reshaped every calculation. Inside Neverland Ranch, the system that once softened impact now transmitted it. Movement through the property became purposeful rather than relaxed. Meetings replaced gatherings. Advisors replaced guests. The ranch still stood, but its function shifted from refuge to headquarters. This change altered how every space was used. Rooms designed for imagination became rooms for strategy. Silence carried weight. Every choice felt consequential because every choice was watched. The owner faced a sequence of decisions that offered no clean outcomes. Delay increased cost. Action increased exposure. The balance that had protected him before no longer held. What made the ranch powerful as a shelter now made it vulnerable as a symbol. It was too large to ignore and too specific to redefine quickly. The estate had been built to express innocence and control at the same time. Under pressure, those meanings collided. Control demanded restriction. Innocence demanded openness. The conflict could not be resolved inside the same walls. As attention intensified, the ranch absorbed it. Gates that once kept distance now marked boundaries. Security increased. Access tightened. The estate began to feel occupied by its own defenses. This was the moment when containment turned inward. The property did not fail structurally. It failed symbolically. It could no longer represent what it was meant to protect. Each response aimed at stabilization carried reputational cost. Each attempt to retreat amplified visibility. The options narrowed until they resembled choices only in form. Inside Neverland Ranch, time compressed. Decisions followed one another without recovery. The environment offered no pause because the stakes allowed none. This phase was not loud. It was procedural. Documents, schedules, constraints. The tragedy was not an act but a process, a system encountering pressure beyond its design. The ranch had been created to hold a life apart from the world. Now the world pressed against it from every side. What followed would not be sudden. It would be decisive. The decisive moment arrived not as spectacle, but as inevitability. At a certain point, maintaining Neverland Ranch required choices that contradicted its original purpose. Resources were redirected toward defense rather than creation. Legal strategy shaped daily logistics. Financial planning overruled emotional attachment. The ranch began operating under conditions it had never been designed to endure. What once symbolized freedom now demanded compliance. The land itself became part of the calculation. Its scale magnified cost. Its identity magnified scrutiny. Every feature that once made it exceptional now increased exposure. The estate could not be downsized without losing meaning. It could not remain unchanged without escalating risk. This deadlock defined the tragedy. Inside the property, rooms took on new roles without ceremony. Areas once associated with wonder became unused or restricted. Maintenance crews replaced entertainers. Silence replaced sound. The transition was not announced. It simply happened. The ranch adapted by subtracting. Attractions were shut down, pathways closed. What remained was structure without animation. The fantasy withdrew first, the infrastructure followed. For the owner, this phase carried emotional weight that did not translate into action. Attachment slowed decision-making. Responsibility accelerated consequence. The longer the ranch remained suspended between identities, the heavier it became. Eventually, the cost of holding on exceeded the cost of letting go. That realization marked the true collapse. Not a loss of property, but a loss of alignment. The place no longer matched the life surrounding it. Decisions that once protected, now confined. Retreat no longer preserved safety. It prolonged exposure. The ranch had reached a point where its existence amplified the very pressures it had been built to escape. When decisive steps were finally taken, they felt less like choices and more like acknowledgments. The tragedy was not that Neverland Ranch changed. It was that it could not change enough without ceasing to be itself. In that gap between preservation and surrender, the story crossed its point of no return. What followed was not a single dramatic act, but a sequence of irreversible steps. Once the direction shifted, it did not pause. Neverland Ranch moved from defense to dismantling with quiet efficiency. Activities ended without announcements. Equipment was removed without ceremony. Spaces that had defined the identity of the estate were neutralized, not destroyed, but stripped of function. The logic was practical: reduce risk, lower visibility, stabilize cost. Yet each practical measure carried symbolic loss. The ranch was no longer asked to inspire. It was asked to disappear. This transformation altered the emotional relationship to the property. What had once been a refuge became an obligation that required constant explanation. The estate stopped protecting its owner from the outside world and began anchoring him to it. Every decision tied him more tightly to the place he needed distance from. This inversion completed the tragedy. The ranch had been built to separate life from pressure. Now it concentrated pressure in one location. Letting go became the only path forward, not because attachment was gone, but because attachment had become unsustainable. When the process concluded, there was no singular moment of closure, no final walk, no farewell scene. The change was registered through absence. Rides stood still, paths emptied, sound faded. Neverland Ranch remained standing, but it no longer functioned as a living environment. It existed as property, not as vision. This distinction mattered. A place can survive structurally while dying narratively. That is what occurred here. The collapse was complete not when the gates closed, but when the meaning left. From that point on, the ranch could be sold, renamed, or repurposed, but it could never return to what it had been. The tragedy reached its endpoint quietly. A world designed to never grow up was forced to confront finality, and in doing so, it lost the very quality it was created to preserve. After the collapse, Neverland Ranch did not vanish. It entered a different phase of existence, one defined by paperwork, valuation, and distance. The first question was ownership, not meaning. Control shifted from personal vision to legal structure. Decisions were made in offices far from the gates. The estate became an asset to be managed rather than a world to be lived in. This change altered the pace immediately. Silence replaced activity not as loss but as policy. The land was maintained, but only enough to preserve value. What remained was careful neutrality. Nothing was added, nothing was celebrated. The ranch was held in suspension, stripped of narrative and treated as property awaiting resolution. Public memory continued to circle it, but from the outside, inside, access narrowed further. The gates stayed closed more often. Paths were cleared, not walked. Buildings stood intact, yet detached from purpose. The transition revealed a hard truth. Estates can survive scandal more easily than stories can. The physical structure of Neverland Ranch proved durable. Its symbolic function did not. As ownership questions settled, the market took over. Price became the dominant language. The estate was measured by acreage, structures, and maintenance cost, not by what it once promised. Each reassessment pushed it further from its original identity. Time did not restore meaning. It erased urgency. The longer the ranch remained unused, the easier it became to imagine it as something else. A blank slate, a quiet investment. This was the beginning of its afterlife. Not revival, but persistence without intention. The ranch existed in a state of pause, known everywhere and used nowhere. For the public, it became a reference point. For administrators, a line item. The distance between those two perspectives defined this stage. Neverland Ranch was no longer asked to explain itself. It was asked to remain stable. In doing so, it lost the last traces of motion that once made it feel alive. The afterlife did not arrive with transformation. It arrived with stillness. As time passed, the estate entered the market with expectations shaped by memory rather than function. Neverland Ranch was known everywhere, yet understood narrowly. Buyers did not approach it as a home. They approached it as a problem to solve. The scale that once inspired now complicated negotiations. The name carried weight that no renovation could remove. Appraisals adjusted downward as reality replaced legend. Each listing reframed the ranch in practical terms. Acreage, infrastructure, maintenance, access. The distance between asking price and outcome revealed how meaning depreciates faster than land. Public fascination remained, but it did not translate into demand. The estate became visible without being desirable. This gap defined its second afterlife. It existed as an object of curiosity rather than ambition. Potential owners evaluated not only cost, but inheritance of attention. To acquire the property was to inherit a narrative already written. Renaming became necessary, not as erasure, but as insulation. Identity had to be neutralized for value to stabilize. The fantasy was not restored. It was quieted. Landscaping softened edges. Features were simplified. What could be mistaken for symbolism was reduced. The goal shifted from revival to normalization. In this phase, the ranch was reshaped without spectacle. Changes were incremental and administrative. The intention was distance, not transformation. The estate learned how to be overlooked. This was progress of a different kind, not growth, but survival in a new register. As listings cycled and time advanced, the public adjusted. Attention moved elsewhere. The ranch settled into anonymity by design. Its afterlife depended on forgetting, not remembrance. In becoming less itself, it became easier to hold. The market finally responded not to what the place had been, but to what it could become if left alone. That compromise defined the estate's passage forward. In its final afterlife, Neverland Ranch existed as something deliberately restrained. Ownership settled into discretion. Activity was minimized. The estate was no longer framed as a destination, but as land with limits clearly defined. What remained was not absence, but containment. The fantasy had been fully extracted, yet the structure endured. Buildings stood without invitation. Roads led inward without promise. The ranch learned how to persist without attracting attention. This version of the estate reflected a broader truth about legacy. Physical places outlast emotional intention, but they do not preserve it. What survives is form, not feeling. The name changed. The purpose narrowed. The public gradually accepted the new silence. Memory lingered, but it no longer directed use. The ranch became a place people recognized but did not approach. Its value stabilized once expectation disappeared. In this way, the afterlife reached equilibrium, not redemption, not rebirth, a managed quiet. The estate had completed its transition from symbol to asset. It no longer carried a story forward. It held ground. That was enough. Neverland Ranch still occupied space in the world, but it no longer tried to define it. Its final state was not tragedy or triumph. It was persistence without voice, a landscape that remained after meaning had moved on. Today, if you approach the gates of Neverland Ranch, the experience is quieter than its reputation. The road curves gently. Trees hold their distance. There is no announcement of arrival, only a sense of boundary. You pass structures that remain intact, yet uninviting, maintained without display. Paths extend forward without instruction. Rooms exist without expectation. The place feels organized around restraint. It does not ask to be remembered. It asks to be left alone. As you move through the grounds, the absence of activity becomes the dominant presence. Silence replaces spectacle. Order replaces emotion. This is not abandonment. It is a managed calm. In the architecture, you can still read the intentions of another time. The wide spaces built for gathering. The long corridors designed to separate noise from rest. But intention does not operate here anymore. It lingers only as outline. The estate stands as evidence of a life that tried to solve pressure with distance, and imagination with control. It worked for a while. Then it asked more than it could give. Walking through the present version of the ranch, it becomes clear that houses can outlive the reasons they were built. Walls endure. Landscapes persist. Meaning moves on. What remains is a lesson written in scale rather than words. Grandeur does not guarantee refuge. Isolation does not ensure peace. A place designed to protect innocence cannot shield it from time. Neverland Ranch now functions as a container for memory rather than a generator of experience. People recognize it without entering. They speak its name without touching its ground. That distance is part of its final form. The story does not end with sale or renaming. It ends with a question that stays relevant long after the gates close. When we build places to escape the world, are we creating shelter? Or are we building something that will eventually hold us in place? The ranch does not answer. It stands still. And in that stillness, it reflects the cost of trying to freeze a moment that was always moving forward.